You're getting you analysis on that meeting in the Oval Office. Joining us from London is Professor Stephen Chan from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Professor Chan, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us. There was a lot of build-up yesterday to that meeting in the Oval Office, wasn't there? And I think perhaps, particularly in South Africa, a bit of a fear of what some news outlets are describing as the Oval Office smackdowns and what could have happened in this meeting between Trump and Ramaphosa.
There was fear, it was rightly feared, but the good thing is that Ramaphosa handled it very, very well. Trump and his people tried this before with another visiting president, and that was President Zelensky from Ukraine. And Zelensky tried to fight back. And this only led to more vitriol. Ramaphosa's response, calm, cool, collected, was really a triumph in terms of statesmanship, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of the presentation of South Africa as a reasonable country. So despite the theatrics of President Trump, President Ramaphosa responded in a very, very good manner.
Right. I mean, it must have been hard, I imagine, for the South African president to stay quiet in the face of particular statements by Trump. One of them, Trump says what's happening to white Afrikaner farmers is like the opposite of what happened during apartheid.
Well, yes, and of course, Ramaphosa was very much committed to the fight against apartheid. But what really helped was the composition of the South African delegation. It wasn't just the president. It was a whole variety of people, including the Minister of Agriculture, other people who came from the white community, the two golfers to appeal to Donald Trump's love of golf, and a very, very prominent businessman. So all of these things led to a balanced delegation and the putting forward of views that said, yes, we have got problems, but they're not about killing white farmers. There's a crime problem in general that affects everybody. And I think the television cameras caught all of that. And I think television viewers would not have been entirely persuaded by Donald Trump's accusations without any real foundations.
I mean, what about the optics of that, of the fact that we had South Africa's richest man, Johan Rupert, in the room. We had a selection of successful white golfers appealing to the US president's love of golf. I mean, did we, as the South African delegation, feed into this notion of white-splaining, that we needed particularly members of the white community, white men, to go and explain that actually the situation in South Africa is not as bad as it sounds after all, particularly not for this minority on the agenda?
I don't think it was white-splaining so much as very pragmatic television. In other words, fearing that President Trump would launch an ambush of this sort, appealing to a certain sort of audience. It was that kind of audience that the delegation needed to address. And because of that, having white members of the delegation was exactly the right thing to do, to explain to an obviously often biased white viewing audience that things were not as the president was trying to suggest. So the key presentation should have been from John Steenhuisen. He said all the right things. I think he underperformed, however. He could have been a very, very powerful voice. In other words, a white voice from within the cabinet, from within government. And he should have been briefed much more clearly as to what to go for, what to say. But overall, I think there was no choice but to have a delegation of a mixed sort like that.
Yeah, I want to talk more about John Steenhuisen and his performance and what he had to say in that meeting. He spoke for quite an amount of time, for quite a few minutes compared to some of the other speakers. Did you think, Professor Chan, that he was trying to sort of straddle a middle line on this notion of a white genocide in South Africa?
Basically, if he was trying to do that, it came across simply as somewhat confused. In other words, neither here nor there. As a member of the government, even though it's a very, very shaky coalition government, but as a member of the government holding a government portfolio that's directly related to the whole question of farmers, black and white, he should have been far more authoritative in terms of, look, I'm the Minister of Agriculture. It's my job to know what's going on. And I, as the Minister of Agriculture, emphatically say that all of these tales of slaughtering of white farmers is untrue. He should have come across far, far more emphatically, far more definitively, exercising his portfolio. He's the man responsible. And as the man responsible, as the minister responsible, he should have basically taken center stage and said, I know, I am the one who knows what is going on. I know what I'm talking about. And I think he missed his cue. He was not emphatic enough. He was trying to, as you say, straddle. When you try to straddle too much, you simply get torn apart trying to do the splits.
Right. There was a question from one of the journalists, in fact, a journalist from our organization, Newzroom Afrika, Ziyanda Ngobo, where she asked Donald Trump, in fact, what will it take to convince you that there isn't a white genocide in South Africa? And what I thought was a stroke of genius, I suppose I have to say that I am South African, so I'm probably biased on the story, Professor Chan. But Cyril Ramaphosa came in there and he said, I will answer that. What it's going to take is for the president to listen.
Yes, that was brilliant. And it reflected the maturity of Ramaphosa and his sense of timing. Here's a golden question. Well, look, let me get in first. And he did. He took the words right out of anyone else's mouth and he basically laid it on the line. Look, listen to people from a wider part of the population of South Africa. Listen to a representative sample of voices. Get your people out there to take proper, as it were, opinion soundings of South Africa. Listen to the South Africans, black and white. So that was a masterstroke on Ramaphosa's part.
And I mean, did we need to have? I just want to go back to the issue of the delegation that we had on the part of South Africa, Professor Chan. Were the statistics and the numbers, were they never going to be enough for Donald Trump and for his government? The numbers around the percentage of people that make up the white population, just over 7% in South Africa, and the fact that they own over 80% of the land. The numbers insofar as farm murders are concerned, they are alarming, and no one in South Africa will deny that we have a very real crime problem. And as much was said in the Oval Office last night, but that black people are disproportionately impacted by violent crime in our country. Were those facts never going to be enough for Donald Trump?
Not in front of a television audience. Trump is a master of optics, and he had a viewing audience that he was going for. What probably was far more rationally discussed and using figures of this sort, using data of this sort, would have been the real situation, and that would have been done behind closed doors. Apparently, the informal discussions were, as your reporter suggested, far more positive. They were preceded by an informal discussion over dinner. Apparently, they laid it on, a really, really nice dinner. And then the discussions continued, including members of very, very senior parts of the government of the United States, not just the president. So the real business would have been done in those closed-door discussions. When you confront Donald Trump on public media, he basically just plays to what he thinks is his Make America Great Again audience. He can't stop doing that. It was an ambush. It was choreographed. It was choreographed precisely to appeal to a certain sort of viewing audience. You're not going to get a university seminar under these kinds of conditions. That kind of seminaring, but conducted in a very informal way, would have taken place afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, there were so many interesting moments, Professor Chan. One of them was a discussion around a plane. Cyril Ramaphosa joking that South Africa doesn't have a plane to gift to Air Force One. There was also Trump's references to the NBC reporter Peter Alexander several times, calling him a jerk, calling him an idiot. I mean, we've never received that kind of treatment, I can tell you, as journalists here in South Africa. What did you make of that kind of behavior from Trump?
But he calls lots of journalists and lots of media networks jerks, words even worse than that. You know, ABC, a very, very distinguished television channel, is fake news, for instance, insulting and putting people down in a very vulgar way as part of his vocabulary. Again, it plays to what he thinks is his voting base. He's a populist president, and he goes for the populism big time. So I wouldn't be surprised. The gentle joking of Ramaphosa, sorry, we don't have a plane, it was also a bit of a dig, because after the Qataris gave him a beautiful plane, people in the Pentagon had to take a long, long look at it to see whether it could actually be converted for presidential duties. So it's a bit of a dig as well as a bit of a joke. So once again, some kind of nuancing that came out of the South African president, I think deliberately to contrast with the tub thumping of the American president.
And what a contrast it was. Professor Stephen Chan, it's been a pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. He's a professor of politics and international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London.